Apache promise is stronger than iron.
Ace, I'm not much of a husband, but I can try to be a decent man.
That is more than most men manage.
May your spirit soar free.
Go in peace. Alaninihi.
I rode into that canyon alone, my pistol belt hanging from the saddle horn, knowing full well I might never ride out. Behind me, 9 good men lay dead drivers. I'd hired men with families waiting for word that would never come. Ahead, somewhere in those towering red cliffs, waited the most feared Apache war chief in the Southwest, Quanah Parker. The army called him a savage. The settlers wanted him hanged. But I was about to bet my life that he was something else entirely, a man of honor in a world that had forgotten what that word meant. They say a man's character shows clearest in how he faces death. On that scorching afternoon in 1870, I was about to find out if that was true for both of us. This is a work of historical fiction. Names and events are used for dramatic effect. My name is Thomas Brennan, and before that fateful ride, I was nothing more than what the territory made me, a former Army scout turned stagecoach line manager, trying to carve an honest living from the unforgiving Arizona desert. I'd learned Apache language during my scouting days, not out of sympathy necessarily, but out of survival. You don't track a man for months without beginning to understand how he thinks, how he sees the world. The mail route I managed stretched from Tucson to the mining camps in the White Mountains, 200 miles of dust rock and Apache territory. For 16 months I'd watched my business bleed to death, one driver at a time. Johnson was first found with 3 arrows in his back, the mail scattered across a ravine. Then Peterson Harrison, the Cruz brothers. Each time I'd stand over another grave while their widows wept, wondering how long before no one would take the job at any price. The Army offered protection, which meant nothing. Captain Morrison and his cavalry boys would thunder through the territory every few weeks, see nothing, and thunder back to the fort to file reports no one would read. Meanwhile, my men kept dying. I remember the day I made my decision. Old Charlie McBride, weathered as boot leather and brave as they come, threw his driver's whip on my desk and said, "Tom, I got grandchildren. I can't drive a route where 9 men have died in 16 months. Not for any amount of money." I couldn't blame him. Hell, I was surprised he'd lasted that long. That night, I sat alone in my office, a bottle of whiskey and a loaded pistol on the desk in front of me. The easy choice was right there. 1 bullet, and all these problems would be someone else's burden. But I kept thinking about something I'd learned during my scouting days. The Apache didn't kill randomly. Every raid had a reason, a pattern, a logic. They weren't mindless savages. They were warriors fighting for their homeland, the only way they knew how. If they were warriors following orders, then there was a commander. And if there was a commander, maybe, just maybe, he could be reasoned with. It was the longest of long shots. But it was the only shot I had left. I spent 2 weeks preparing for what everyone else called suicide. I sent word through every Apache contact I'd cultivated during my scouting years, old women who traded in the border towns, half-breed guides, even a captured warrior I'd once treated fairly when I could have seen him hanged. The message was simple. Thomas Brennan wishes to speak with Quanah Parker. He comes alone, unarmed, to talk, not to fight. I got no reply. I hadn't expected one. On a Tuesday morning, in late August, when the heat made the air shimmer like water, I saddled my best horse, a steady mare named Sarah, who wouldn't spook at shadows, and rode north into the Chiricahua Mountains. I wore no gun, carried no knife. My only weapons were a canteen, a white flour sack flag tied to a stick, and hope that the Apache scouts watching me, and I knew they were watching, would report back that this crazy white man might be worth their chief's time. The canyon I sought was known to locals as Death's Throat, a narrow gorge where the cliffs rose so high that sunlight only touched the canyon floor for an hour at midday. It was a natural fortress, impossible to attack, easy to defend. Perfect Apache territory. I found the entrance just before noon. My hands were steady on the reins. Fear, I'd learned long ago, was a luxury scouts couldn't afford, but my mouth was dry as the desert itself. I raised the white flag and called out in Apache, "I am Thomas Brennan. I come in peace to speak with Quanah Parker. I am unarmed. I seek counsel, not war." My words echoed off the canyon walls, then silence. I waited. Sarah shifted beneath me, sensing my tension. Then, like ghosts materializing from stone, 3 Apache warriors emerged from the rocks. Young men, lean and hard, with faces that revealed nothing. Each carried a rifle. Each could have killed me 6 different ways before I could even think about running. The tallest one spoke. "You are foolish, white man." "Yes," I agreed in his language, "but I am honest. I wish to speak with your chief. I have words he should hear. Give me your weapons. I carry none." He stepped forward, checked me roughly but thoroughly. When he found nothing, surprise flickered across his face just for a moment, but I saw it. A white man riding alone into Apache territory without so much as a pocket knife was unheard of. "You will come. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look at our women. You will touch nothing." "Understand, I understand." They led me deeper into the canyon, Sarah's hooves echoing off stone. We passed hidden camps, wickiups tucked into alcove smoke from cooking fires dissipating in the updrafts. Children stopped playing to stare. Women paused in their work, watching with dark, unreadable eyes. Warriors emerged from the shadows, hands on weapons, measuring me. And then, in a clearing where a spring fed a small pool, I saw him. Quanah Parker was not what I expected, and I'd been expecting someone formidable. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, towering by Apache standards, with shoulders that spoke of years wielding weapons and riding hard. But it was his face that struck me. The newspapers called him a savage, a bloodthirsty butcher. The man before me had intelligent eyes that seemed to look straight through pretense to truth, and a sadness that sat heavy on features still young. He couldn't have been more than 35, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd lived a dozen lifetimes. He sat on a flat rock surrounded by his warriors, but somehow separate from them. When he looked at me, I felt the weight of that gaze, not hostile exactly, but measuring, judging, deciding whether I was worth the breath it would take to speak to me. I dismounted slowly, keeping my hands visible. The warrior who'd brought me grabbed my gun belt from the saddle, a symbolic gesture since I'd already been searched, and laid it at Quanah's feet. Quanah looked at the empty belt, then at me. When he finally spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You are the one who manages the talking wire wagons." Not a question. "The mail coaches, yes. My name is, I know your name, Thomas Brennan. I know you were once a wolf scout for the Bluecoats. I know you speak our tongue. I know you have treated Apache prisoners with respect when others would have killed them. I also know my warriors have killed 9 of your men in the past seasons." He paused. "Why are you still alive?" It was the question everything hinged on. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now standing before him, all my prepared speeches seemed hollow. So I told him the simple truth. "Because killing me won't solve your problem, or mine. You kill my men to drive the whites from your land. I understand this. If strangers crossed my father's farm without permission, I would fight them too. But I am not the army. I don't want your land. I just want my men to live long enough to deliver mail and feed their families. So I came to ask, is there a way we both get what we want?" Silence. The warriors around us shifted, hands tightening on weapons. No white man spoke to their chief like this as an equal, without groveling or demanding. Quanah stood. He was slightly taller than me, and the effect was deliberately intimidating. He walked closer, studying me with those penetrating eyes. "You speak of wants," he said quietly. What can you give me that I cannot take? Truth, I said. I can't give you your land back, that's beyond my power. I can't make the army leave, I'm not a general. I can't stop the miners or the settlers. But I can promise you this, I will never lie to you. Not once. Not ever. And if you let my coaches pass safely through your territory, I will tell you honestly what's happening in the white man's world, the troop movements, the political changes, the dangers coming your way. Information is a weapon. I'm offering to share it. Another long silence. Then Quanah did something that shocked everyone present, including his own men. He smiled. Not a big smile, but genuine. You have courage, Thomas Brennan. A foolish courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. You ride into the home of your enemies with no weapon, no protection, no hope of rescue. This is either great bravery or great stupidity. He paused. I think it is both. And I respect both. He turned, spoke rapidly in Apache to his warriors. Debate erupted, voices raised in argument. I caught enough to understand some wanted to kill me on principle, some thought my offer was a trick, others were intrigued, but cautious. Quanah let them argue, then raised one hand. Instant silence. He turned back to me. I will accept your proposal, but with conditions. My warriors will not attack your male coaches, only your male coaches. Any soldiers, any settlers, any other whites who enter our land will be met with arrows and bullets, as always. Your drivers must carry no weapons beyond what's needed to hunt for food. They must not leave the trail. They must not stop at our water sources. And if any of your men harm an Apache, any Apache, the agreement ends and we resume the war. Do you accept these terms? I do. Then we have an agreement, Thomas Brennan. Break your word and I will kill you myself. But keep it. He extended his hand not in a white man's handshake, but palm to palm in the Apache way. And you will find that an Apache's promise is stronger than iron. I pressed my palm to his. His grip was like stone. One more thing, Quanah said. You will return here in 1 moon. You will bring news from the outside and we will talk again. I want to see if your tongue remains straight when there is no danger to force it. A man's truth under threat means less than his truth when he is safe. I'll be here. As I rode out of that canyon alive and with an agreement I'd barely dared hope for, I realized something profound. I hadn't just made a business arrangement. I'd made a friend. And in the violent, hate-filled world of 1870 Arizona, that was more dangerous than any enemy. True to my word, I returned 1 month later. And the month after that? And the month after that? At first our meetings were cautious, 2 men from different worlds testing each other's trustworthiness. I brought news, troop movements, political decisions in Washington, rumors of new campaigns. Quanah listened intently, asked sharp questions, and shared his own information where settlers were illegally squatting on treaty lands, which army officers could be trusted, which couldn't. But somewhere in those monthly meetings, something shifted. We stopped being negotiators and became what friends seems inadequate. Brothers perhaps, though, bound by something deeper than blood, bound by mutual respect and the rare gift of understanding. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. I remember the day Quanah asked me about my family. Not as a tactical question, but genuine curiosity. I told him about my father's farm in Missouri, about my mother who died when I was 12, about a sister I hadn't seen in 15 years. He listened with an intensity that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. Then he told me about his own mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman captured as a child and raised Apache who'd loved her adopted people more than the white world that eventually reclaimed her by force. He spoke of her with a grief so raw it was painful to witness. She'd died a decade earlier, broken by being torn from her Apache family and forced back into white society that saw her as a curiosity, a tragedy, a problem to be solved. She taught me, Quanah said quietly, that the color of skin matters less than the color of heart. She was white, but she was Apache where it counted in here. He touched his chest. You are white, Thomas, but you have an Apache heart. That is why we can speak truth to each other. From that day forward, I wasn't just a male coach manager who'd made a clever deal. I was Quanah's friend, welcomed in his camps, trusted with his people's secrets, privy to his strategy and his doubts. I learned that Quanah wasn't fighting because he hated white people. He was fighting because every promise made to his people had been broken. Every treaty signed had been violated. Every guarantee of protection had proven worthless. He'd tried peace. He'd tried negotiation. Only when a young, arrogant army lieutenant had lured him into a parley under a white flag, then arrested him for a crime he didn't commit, had Quanah become the savage warrior the newspapers now feared. They made me into what they claimed I already was, he told me once, staring into a campfire. I wanted peace. I tried peace. They taught me that peace is what whites offer before they steal everything you have. Not all whites think like that, I said. He looked at me. I know. You are proof. But you are one man, Thomas. Out there, he gestured toward the darkness. Beyond the firelight are thousands who think Apache are animals to be tamed or eliminated. How do I make peace with that? I had no answer. Because he was right. The arrangement worked beautifully. For 16 months, not a single one of my drivers was attacked. Mail flowed through Apache territory as safely as through Kansas farmland. My business thrived. Other coach lines looked on with envy and suspicion. But success breeds enemies. The whiskey peddlers were first. Unscrupulous men who'd been making a fortune selling rot-gut whiskey to young Apache warriors in exchange for stolen horses or goods. I'd heard Quanah's anguished complaints about how alcohol was destroying his people's discipline, turning warriors into drunks. So I started hunting the peddlers. I had no legal authority, but I didn't need it. I knew the territory, I knew where they operated, and I had motivation. The first two I caught got off easy. I destroyed their inventory and told them to never come back. The third tried to pull a gun on me. He lived but barely and spent 6 months recovering from the beating I gave him. Word spread Thomas Brennan had gone native. He was protecting Apaches over his own kind. The newspapers in Tucson and Prescott started running editorials. Brennan's betrayal, one headline screamed, "White man turned Indian lover threatens territory security." They demanded I be arrested, investigated, removed. I ignored them. But I couldn't ignore what came next. Silver. They found silver in the mountains, Quanah's mountains. Within weeks, miners began illegally crossing into Apache territory, tearing up the earth, fouling the springs, leaving trash and devastation in their wake. The Apache warriors wanted to kill them all. Quanah held them back, barely, because he'd given me his word about maintaining peace along the mail route. But the intrusions were violating the spirit of our agreement, and he knew it. I rode to the mining camps and ordered them off Apache land. They laughed at me. One particularly belligerent miner, a bull of a man named Karsten, spat at my feet and said, "You got no authority here, Brennan. This is federal land now. The savages just don't know it yet." "This is treaty land," I corrected him. "Protected by federal law." "Laws change," Karsten sneered. "Especially when there's money involved. Now get out of my way before I forget you used to be white." I reported the situation to the Indian agent in Tucson, a political appointee named Dawson, who'd never met an Apache and didn't want to. He listened to my complaint with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you've formed some sort of attachment to these Indians. But the reality is that Arizona needs development. Silver means jobs, revenue growth. If a few Apache have to be relocated, that's the price of progress." Relocated, I felt rage building in my chest. These people have lived here for centuries. We signed treaties guaranteeing treaties can be renegotiated. The Apache will be fine. We'll find them new land. You mean land nobody else wants? Barren, worthless land where they'll starve or die of disease. Dawson shrugged. That's not my decision to make. I just implement policy. He leaned forward. And Mr. Brennan, I'd advise you to stay out of this. Your friendship with Quanah Parker has been noted. In the wrong light, it could look like you're collaborating with hostile Indians against American interests. That's a serious charge. The threat was clear. Keep quiet or face consequences. I didn't keep quiet. In 1872, the walls finally closed in. The army was tired of chasing ghosts in the mountains, but the mining companies were hungry for silver. They offered the one thing every Apache feared most: a treaty. A reservation. To a warrior, that word meant confinement. It meant watching your children forget who they were. It meant a slow death of the spirit. Quanah Parker was a warrior, but he was also a pragmatist. He called a council where I sat as the only white man surrounded by faces hardened by years of betrayal. I have fought the whites for a decade, Quanah told his people, his voice heavy with the weight of command. But I can count. For every soldier I kill, 10 more arrive. We can choose how we lose this war, with our people dead or with our people alive. I choose life. The silence in that canyon was deafening. Then Quanah turned to me with a gaze that pinned me to the stone. But I will sign on one condition, he declared. Thomas Brennan must be the agent who oversees us. I trust no other white man. If you refuse, we fight until the last breath. I was stunned. I had no political power, no connections. But the threat of continued war forced the Bureau's hand. On a cold November morning, the treaty was signed. As the ink dried, Quanah whispered to me in Apache, "This will not end well, my friend. We have bought time. Perhaps time is all we can buy." He was right, but for 4 years we made that borrowed time count. My tenure as agent was a war of a different kind. While other agents forced their charges to cut their hair and worship a white god, I refused to let Quanah's people commit cultural suicide. I encouraged their ceremonies. I respected their ways. The reservation was peaceful. We needed no soldiers to keep order, but my methods made me enemies in Washington. "You're failing to civilize them," an inspector sneered at me once. "I'm keeping them alive," I shot back. But the real enemy wasn't policy. It was corruption. Supplies promised by the treaty, food, blankets, tools, vanished into the pockets of greedy contractors. When the beef rations failed to arrive, I didn't write reports. I drained my own life savings to buy cattle from local ranchers just to keep bellies full. One evening, as we watched children play near the agency office, Quanah turned to me. "You spend your own gold to feed my people?" he observed quietly. "That is foolish." "It's necessary," I replied. He looked at me then with a depth of respect I had never seen in any man's eyes. "A chief's wealth means nothing if his people hunger. Few white men understand this. That is why you are my brother, not just my friend." Brother. In the Apache world, that word is stronger than iron. It isn't spoken lightly. At that moment I realized I wasn't just an official anymore. I was one of them. But brotherhood works both ways, and the storm gathering on the horizon was about to test that bond until it shattered. 2 years into my tenure, Quanah decided I was living wrong. "A man cannot live well alone," he told me one evening, leading me to a small wickiup up at the edge of the settlement. Inside, a woman with eyes sharp as obsidian looked up from her fire. "This is Dahkeya," Quanah said. "Her husband was killed by raiders. She needs security. You need a home that isn't a mess. I propose you take her as your woman." I was stunned. I started to protest, to ask for time, but Quanah cut me off. "Stop thinking like a white man, making simple things complicated. The foundation is practical. The rest affection partnership will come later. Or it won't. Dahkeya looked at me, assessing my soul. I have heard of the white agent who speaks our tongue, she said. If you are respectful, I agree. This is practical. And so improbably, we began a life together. It was awkward at first, two strangers circling each other in a small room. But Quanah was right. As weeks turned to months, the silence between us changed from wary to comfortable. One night by the fire, she told me, "You are a good man, Thomas. Many men look at women but do not see them. You see me." "We are partners," I said, realizing I loved her not with the fire of youth, but with the steady warmth of survival. For a brief time I had everything: purpose, family, and peace. But peace in the Arizona territory was a fragile thing. The miners returned first, fueled by rumors of silver. Then came the politicians. The newspapers called me an Indian lover, accusing me of going native. But the death blow came from Washington. A new commissioner, Horace Grant, arrived with a mandate to clear the way for progress. He spent 3 hours touring the agency, interviewed 0 Apaches, and wrote a report demanding my removal for inappropriate affinity for savage culture. I took the report to Quanah, furious. I was ready to fight, to call in every favor I had left in the capital. But when I found him, he wasn't looking at the horizon. He was hunched over a racking cough, shaking his powerful frame. When he straightened, he wiped his mouth with a cloth. It came away stained with bright, fresh blood. "Thomas," he said, his voice raspy and thin, lacking the thunder it once held. "Look at me." I stared at the blood on the cloth, my stomach dropping. "You cannot stop this," he said, gently tapping the damning report. "You are one honest man in a system built on lies. You have given my people 4 years of dignity. But your fight is over. Mine is about to end too." "We can get a doctor," I stammered. The army surgeon at the Fort Quanah shook his head, pressing a hand to his chest where the sickness rattled with every breath. "It is the lung sickness. It consumes me from the inside like a fire that refuses to die. I have seen enough death to know its approaching footsteps." He looked at me with eyes that were tired but unafraid. "Soon I will be gone, Thomas. And when I am gone, they will have no reason to honor any agreement. They will take this land, scatter my people, and erase us as if we never existed." "No," I said fiercely, though my voice trembled. "I won't let that happen." Quanah smiled, a sad, knowing expression that broke my heart. "You are a good friend, Thomas Brennan. But even friendship has limits against the tide of history." Quanah died 6 months later. The Bureau reported it as pneumonia. Dahkeya, who'd tended him in his final days, told me the truth: stomach cancer that had eaten him from the inside, leaving the great war chief to die slowly, painfully, while his body betrayed him the way so many treaties had. I was with him at the end. His family surrounded him, wives, children, warriors who'd followed him through a dozen campaigns. But he called me to his side, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me, Thomas. Promise you will protect them after I am gone." "I promise," I said, tears streaming down my face without shame. "I swear it, brother." He smiled. "I know you will try. That is all any man can do, try." He gripped my hand with surprising strength. "You gave me something precious in our years together, proof that the wall between our peoples is not unbreakable. Somewhere in some future I will not see, perhaps others will build on what we began. Tell our story, Thomas. Don't let them forget that an Apache chief and a white man once stood as brothers." Those were his last words to me. He died as the sun was setting, surrounded by his people with dignity intact, despite all the indignities he'd suffered. We buried him according to Apache custom, in a hidden place in the mountains he'd defended for so long. I stood apart during the ceremony, respecting the private grief of his family, but Dahkeya came to me afterward. "You are Apache enough to grieve with us," she said. "Come." I joined the circle of mourners, and for the first time in my adult life, I wept openly. The bureaucrats waited exactly 2 weeks before making their move. With Quanah gone, they no longer needed to pretend to honor any agreements. A telegram arrived from Washington Terse, and Final Agent Thomas Brennan is hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. All Apache currently residing on Chiricahua Reservation are to be relocated to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona Territory. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be met with military force. San Carlos. Even the name was bitter in my mouth. The Apache called it Hell's 40 Acres, a disease-ridden barren piece of desert where mosquitoes bred malaria and hopelessness bred despair. Dozens of tribal groups were crammed together, their traditional enemies forced into proximity with inadequate water, insufficient food, and corrupt agents who saw their charges as nuisances at best. It was a death sentence delivered bureaucratically. I refused to implement the order. For 3 days I held my ground, firing off telegrams to Washington, demanding reviews, citing treaty violations, calling in every favor I'd ever earned. But I was one man fighting a machine designed to destroy people like Quanah's band. On the 4th day, the army arrived. Colonel Patterson, a career officer who'd fought Apache for 20 years, led 2 companies of cavalry onto the reservation. He found me standing outside the agency office, watching his approach with something between defiance and despair. "Mr. Brennan," he said not unkindly, "you know why I'm here. To commit legal genocide, yes." His jaw tightened. "I'm following orders. As are you, unless you want to face court-martial for insubordination. I'm a civilian. You can't court-martial me. Then arrest and imprisonment for interfering with federal operations. The result is the same: you'll be removed and the Apache will be relocated. The only question is whether you resist and make it harder for everyone, or accept reality and try to make the transition as smooth as possible." I wanted to fight. God, how I wanted to fight. But I looked past Patterson, at his troops, at their weapons, at the overwhelming force arrayed against us. If I resisted, people would die. The Apache would resist. There would be bloodshed. And in the end, the result would be the same, except with corpses added to the tragedy. "How long do I have?" I asked hoarsely. 3 days to prepare them. Then we march. 3 days. 3 days to dismantle 4 years of carefully built peace. 3 days to break the promise I'd made to a dying friend. I'll never forget those 3 days, as long as I live. The Apache people knew what was coming. They'd seen it happen to other tribes. The grief was palpable, not loud and dramatic, but quiet and deep. Old women wept silently as they dismantled wickiups. Warriors stared at mountains they'd never see again with expressions of such loss it hurt to witness. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Why must we leave? When can we come back? What did we do wrong? Nothing. They'd done nothing wrong except exist on land someone else wanted. Dahkeya helped me through those awful days. She packed our shared possessions methodically, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Only at night, in the darkness of our quarters, did she let herself feel. "This was always going to happen," she said one night. "We knew it. Quanah knew it. You knew it. But knowing doesn't make it hurt less." "I failed him," I said. "I promised to protect his people, and I failed." She turned to me, fierce despite her grief. "You gave us 4 years, Thomas. 4 years of dignity, of respect, of living as human beings instead of as animals to be managed. No other agent has ever done that. No other white man ever could have. You didn't fail Quanah, you honored him. The failure is not yours. It belongs to your government, your people, your nation that cannot keep its promises." On the morning of the 4th day, we assembled for the march. Over 300 Apache men, women, and children carrying what little they could, leaving behind everything else. Colonel Patterson had provided wagons for the elderly and sick at least. Small mercy. I stood at the front of the column, officially no longer an agent, but unwilling to leave them to face this alone. Patterson didn't object. I think even he understood that some things transcend official duties. As we began to move out, an old woman, a grandmother I'd known for years, approached me. She placed something in my hand, a small leather pouch containing Quanah's tobacco pipe, the one he'd smoked during our countless conversations over 4 years. "He would want you to have this," she said in Apache. "So you remember." "I could never forget," I whispered. "Good. Then tell the world what they did here. Tell them how they broke every promise. Tell them how they stole our land, our dignity, our future. Tell them about Quanah and his white brother who tried to stand against the flood. Tell them it didn't work, but we tried. We tried, and then we walked. 300 souls marching toward a future. None of them wanted leaving behind a past that would never return. I stayed with them all the way to San Carlos, though I had no official reason to. I watched them arrive at that godforsaken place, watched the despair settle over them like a physical weight as they realized this was now their home. Watched children who'd run free in mountain meadows stare at barren desert with uncomprehending eyes. Dahkeya decided to stay with her people. I couldn't blame her. I offered to take her away to start a life somewhere else, but she refused. "My place is with my people," she said simply. "Your place is in the world that did this. Use your white skin, Thomas. Tell our story. Make them see what they've done. That is how you keep your promise to Quanah, not by dying with us, but by bearing witness and refusing to let the world forget." We parted at the gates of San Carlos. No dramatic farewell, just a quiet acknowledgement of what we'd shared and what we'd lost. I never saw her again. Epilogue: the weight of memory. I'm an old man now, writing this from a small cabin in New Mexico territory. 40 years have passed since those events, and the world has changed beyond recognition. The frontier is gone. The Apache are scattered. Most people don't even remember Quanah Parker's name. But I remember. I remember a proud chief who valued honor above survival, who kept every promise he made, even when the world around him broke every promise made to him. I remember warriors who fought not from savagery, but from love of homeland. I remember women and children who wanted nothing more than to live in peace on land their ancestors had walked for centuries. And I remember a friendship that defied everything: race, culture, history, politics. A friendship built on mutual respect and maintained through absolute honesty. A friendship that ultimately couldn't save anyone, but proved that the walls between people are only as solid as we choose to make them. Sometimes young people come to interview me, journalists or historians collecting stories of the Old West. They want tales of gunfights and cavalry charges, dramatic rescues, and last stands. They're disappointed when I tell them the truth, that the real tragedy wasn't the violence, but the quiet breaking of spirits. That the real heroes weren't the ones who fought, but the ones who tried to build bridges in a world determined to burn them. They ask why I care so much about people who are gone, about events that happened before they were born, about a culture that's been assimilated into irrelevance. I tell them what Quanah told me 40 years ago, in a canyon that's now a tourist attraction: a man's wealth means nothing if his people go hungry. Few white men understand this. And I tell them what Dahkeya told me as we parted: tell our story. Make them see what they've done. That is how you keep your promise. So I write. I remember. I bear witness. Because a promise made to a dying friend is eternal, even when the friend is gone. Especially when the friend is gone. Quanah Parker was a great chief, a brilliant strategist, a man of absolute integrity in a world of broken promises. But more than that, he was my brother. And though the world has forgotten him, though his people were scattered and his homeland stolen, though every promise made to him was broken, I remember. And as long as I draw breath, I will keep my final promise to him. I will tell our story. I will make sure the world knows that once in the violent chaos of 1870s Arizona, an Apache chief and a white man stood together as brothers. We failed to change history, but we proved it was possible to try. And sometimes, in a world of broken promises, the attempt itself is victory enough.